Hi everyone! Today we are going to be talking about nutrition for anxiety. So specifically talking about, because I work with a lot of people, and myself included, I've experienced anxiety, generalized anxiety. And it seems that the general tone of anxiety is tips around how to manage it. So almost looking at anxiety as it's this thing that's inevitably going to happen. And so how are we going to control the anxiety in the moment that it arises? And there's a lot of value in that, don't get me wrong. And that's where things like breath work, meditation, exercise, stress management, all of those things come into the picture. But I'm coming at it from the angle of how do we get rid of your anxiety, right? How do we not just learn how to manage it when it flares, but how do we heal the body, heal the brain so that you no longer have to struggle with anxiety at all? So anxiety, with the advent of social media and the fact that we're always go, 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 on, work, and burn the candle at both ends, and so we work long hours and sacrifice sleep, and also many of us sacrifice our nutrition. And so anxiety, for those reasons and more, is at an all-time high in society. From my clinical perspective, I would say that easily probably 75% of the people I work with, anxiety is one of their top 3 reasons bringing them in. We see this epidemic happening a lot in teenagers and even children, but obviously we see it in adults too. And so if there's the last thing I'll say with that also is conditions of the mind. So, psychiatric conditions, mental health, anxiety, depression, OCD, things along those lines, they're often, because they arise in the mind, it often seems, and people are often told, that it has to be treated in the mind. And like I said, I am a huge proponent for therapy, mental health, for talk therapy, meditation, yoga, whatever that might be. I'm a huge proponent of that. But I wanted to have this talk too to bring up this conversation as a condition, looking at anxiety more of a condition of the body and the brain. So we recognize that there's multiple different factors that can contribute to anxiety. There is the emotional trauma, the stress, the adverse childhood experiences. There's more of the emotional aspects that can absolutely affect anxiety. And I acknowledge those, but today we'll focus on some of the more physical aspects, particularly how what you're eating can be influencing your mood. So when looking at the brain, even though it only weighs 2% of our body weight, it demands 20% of our fuel source. The brain is the most sensitive organ to nutrient status and fuel, so blood sugar in this case. And so because of that, the brain is oftentimes the brain is oftentimes one of the first organs to also experience symptoms. So aside from anxiety, that could be poor memory or like memory loss, insomnia, brain fog, low energy. When we look at the nervous system also, it could be pain patterns, fatigue, tingling sensations, numbness. So mood swings even. So I bring up the brain to highlight how sensitive it is of an organ to nutrient status, which means that nutrition is one of the most powerful things that we can do to heal both our brain and mind. And when working with anxiety, that's often one of the first things that clear up with people. Is we make some baseline nutrition changes, get in some baseline supportive supplements, and the anxiety is one of the first things that clears. So that brings me to the point of this talk, which are what are the top 3 things from a nutrition perspective that I would recommend to heal anxiety. So if you're listening to this, these are things that you can start with today to see if this influences your anxiety and gets it to the point where you just don't struggle with it anymore. Not that you have to manage it, just that you don't notice it. Unless, of course, it's in response to something specific. So there's a difference between generalized anxiety and anxiety in response to a life event. In response to a life event, that is having, most commonly having a normal response to something. So you have a deadline at work or a lot more responsibilities, or you're juggling, family and work requirements, have a difficult conversation coming up. I mean, whatever it might be, if it's in response to something, that's different. But if there's this sensation of just low-grade generalized anxiety that's kind of beneath the surface constantly, that's different. And that's where we can start to peel away the layers of the onion and look at what might be contributing to that anxiety within the body. So starting with looking at nutrition, first recommendation is to balance blood sugar. So blood sugar is the body's it's the body's fuel source. It's what we run on to perform all of our daily demands and metabolic needs. So blood sugar, glucose, I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably. As I mentioned before, the brain demands 20% of our fuel source. So everything that we eat, the brain is skimming off 20% of it immediately. After the liver, the brain gets preferential rights over our fuel, which is why some people listening might be able to relate to, if blood sugar gets too low, which is a physiological stressor, some of the first symptoms that we notice are neurological in nature. So things like feelings of being hangry, right? Irritable and just like, oh, I need to eat, I'm cranky, hangry. I kind of lovingly call it. It's not normal, by the way. So if you're constantly feeling that whenever you're hungry and you get moody, that's not a normal thing. That shows that there's poor blood sugar regulation. So hangry, irritable, tired, if you start yawning or like noticeable fatigue. There's what we call the 10, 2, and 4 syndrome, which 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 4 o'clock. So people often report feeling kind of these slumps around mid-morning and mid-afternoon. Shaky or craving carbs, craving sweets particularly after eating. If you notice an increase in energy after eating or a decrease in energy after eating, essentially after eating you shouldn't notice really any change in energy. So all of those are signs that you might have poor blood sugar regulation. And blood sugar is supposed to stay within a narrow range throughout the day, because that ensures that our body has all of the fuel that it might need at any given time to perform all the demands that it has to meet. However, through a variety of different mechanisms, stress being a big one, nutrient deficiencies being a really big one, poor diet, and then there's other factors too. Blood sugar can start to become more of a roller coaster, where now we're going through periods of too low of blood sugar combined with periods of too high. And here I'm talking specifically about when I'm talking about balancing blood sugar, I'm talking specifically about bringing it from this roller coaster into these narrow ranges, more like molehills. So from an anxiety perspective, where blood sugar most commonly relates to anxiety, though there is a relationship between high blood sugar and anxiety, and I'll summarize that one really quickly. What happens with blood sugar is kind of like a Chinese throwing star in the blood. So it damages blood vessels and nerve cells. And this is what we call glycation. So you can think of like if you lick a lollipop and let it air out, it becomes sticky. And the same concept happens, same kind of idea happens when sugar that we eat, or blood sugar, interacts with proteins in our body. It glycates them or makes them kind of sticky. So when you think of proteins, this includes like enzymes and hormones and cell receptors. They don't work as well, essentially. So blood sugar is inherently inflaming to the brain. It kind of jumbles up proteins within the brain and actually directly damages both neurons and what are called microglia cells, glial cells, which are brain support tissue. So it inflames the brain. And in this inflamed state, neuronal connection is hindered. So now nerve cells can't communicate as effectively with each other, which when neurons aren't firing appropriately, more neurons are firing the inappropriate types of neurochemicals, or what we see more commonly is there's an inhibition of certain neurochemicals that we need more of, then that can lead to mental health issues. So depression, anxiety, even psychosis. So that's one relationship with high blood sugar. And high blood sugar can be corrected with the advice that I'm going to give just as easily as low blood sugar. But low blood sugar is where we'll see more of an acute anxiety response. So high blood sugar is definitely part of the picture. That happens over time. Low blood sugar, when your blood sugar drops low, which can happen throughout the day, that can be almost an immediate cue for anxiety. So low blood sugar, on the other hand, is a physiological stressor, as I said just a few minutes ago. And the reason for that is because prehistorically speaking, we didn't necessarily know where our next meal was coming from. So low blood sugar could very well mean famine, right? So because of that, we have hormonal mechanisms in place to be able to bring blood sugar up. One of these is the hormone, two of these are the hormones cortisol and adrenaline. And adrenaline collectively is epinephrine and norepinephrine, but nonetheless, adrenaline. Both of those are released from the adrenal glands. Those are the fight or flight hormones, and they're very energizing in nature, right? And so those three hormones, when released in response to low blood sugar, and especially when this is happening throughout the day, can create that anxious sensation. And then it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what might start as low blood sugar creating anxiety, what we feel, we mentally process. So then our brain, our mind starts trying to make sense of that feeling, which then projects onto different things that might be going on in life. And then this cascade, this kind of vicious cycle starts happening where then we create the anxiety, and then the low blood sugar is fueled, and so it kind of becomes this vicious cycle. When really what's happening in both of these cases with blood sugar imbalance, on one end of the spectrum we have brain inflammation, on the other end of the spectrum we have chronic stress essentially. And nutrient deficiency, which will lead me into my next point, but nutrient in this case being fuel. So the brain is essentially starving. So balancing blood sugar, not only is that one of the tenets, one of the foundational hallmarks of holistic nutrition, but in the case of mental health, it can make a huge, particularly really big difference. So how do you balance blood sugar? At the start, there's a few main tips. One is to start your day with protein. So that could be, generally speaking, I'm a proponent of intermittent fasting, which will also help with balancing blood sugar. In short, though, to start off with this, before we get into the longer trials of intermittent fasting, I would just strive to go 12 hours. 12 hours between dinner and breakfast the next day. Next, the first thing, and I have another live talk on intermittent fasting. So if you look at my page or go to my group, Integrative Health and Nutrition for Chronic Illness, you'll see the video in there that talks about intermittent fasting and the benefits and how it affects blood sugar and how to do it. So I'll skip all of that information today and more so talk about how to start with balancing blood sugar just like tomorrow. So as I was saying, have the first thing that you eat for the day be protein. So this could be a protein shake, it could be a couple of eggs, it could be a piece of meat, it could be nuts and seeds, but something that's protein based. And the reason for that is because carbohydrates are rapidly broken down in the digestive tract and they're rapidly absorbed. So if you go from, blood sugar here, you're in a fasted state in the morning. So if you go from low blood sugar and then you eat carbohydrates, it's immediately going to spike the blood sugar. Or one common pattern that I see is people have like a banana and coffee for breakfast. Or even worse, a banana with coffee and milk, like skim milk and sugar in it. So we just went from 0 to 60 essentially with a blood sugar perspective, from a blood sugar perspective. So going back to Protein is broken down much more slowly and absorbed much more slowly. And so it has this more slow release effect on blood sugar and will prevent the rapid spike. From there, initially, I'll recommend eating roughly every 2 to 3 hours throughout the day. And again, having the whole diet be low glycemic. So kick the sugar completely. Even fruit, have like 1 to 2 servings per day at a max. But otherwise, no processed sugar, no artificial sweeteners, no added sugar. So ditch the sugar, ditch even grains. I would minimize grains. And I'll get to allergens in just a minute. So ditch the sugar. And then low glycemic, so non-starchy vegetables, nuts and seeds, animal protein products, healthy fats like avocado and coconut products, oils like olive oil, things along those lines. And I actually have a nutrition plan for anxiety in my group also. It's a 7-day menu plan. And so you can use this to kind of give you a start because that's exactly what it's formulated on. So nonetheless, start the day with something protein-based. Eat an overall low glycemic diet by emphasizing healthy fats, non-starchy vegetables, and whole minimally processed foods, and ditching the added or refined sugar completely. And then eat every 2 to 3 hours throughout the day to help keep blood sugar balanced throughout the day. Now with time, I'd prefer to start to shift to where that we're not having snacks in between meals, because that actually, when we're having these blood sugar crashes, that's different. But once blood sugar starts balancing, then the fasting will actually help improve insulin sensitivity and help with blood sugar. But nonetheless, for right now, start the day with something protein-based, eat every 2 to 3 hours throughout the day, and go a minimum of 12 hours between dinner and breakfast the next day of fasting. Okay, so that's balancing blood sugar. Second nutrition tip for healing anxiety is to identify food sensitivities. So this one's huge. Food sensitivities are different from allergies. Food sensitivities represent, it's mediated by a different type of immune cell. I'm not going to get too techie. I actually have a different video on that also. But mediated by a different type of immune cell. And the thing with food sensitivities is they can take up to 48 hours for the symptom to manifest. So in other words, if you're sensitive to almonds, for example, an almond that you eat on Monday could cause your anxiety on Wednesday. So that makes it a lot harder to identify what it actually is. However, we have mechanisms to do so. 2 different ways that you can identify a food sensitivity. And here I'm going to share what the top 8 allergens are as a starting point, and also talk about gluten, which kind of goes hand in hand with the top 8 allergens. So the top 8 allergens, and these are places to start when it comes to identifying food sensitivities, are wheat, dairy, fish, even though fatty fish is really a healthy form of fat for the brain. But if you know that you have a fish, or shellfish is the next one allergy, then avoid fish and shellfish. Eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, and soy. So those are a starting point. Not all of them, because some of them do contain healthy fats. And this is part of where testing for food sensitivities really helps cut the guesswork out of identifying what yours are. But nonetheless, what happens with the food sensitivity is when you eat the food, your immune system binds or tags it with an antibody. And all that antibody is a tag. It invites another branch of the immune system to come in and destroy that food with chemicals. But what happens with this antibody food complex is it creates what's called a circulating immune complex. You can think of it like ants to a piece of sugar. And that circulating immune complex can get lodged into different tissue, including the brain. So when the other branch of the immune system comes in to destroy that with chemicals, innocent tissue can get caught in the crossfire in that inflammatory response. And so in the case of the brain, it goes back to that brain inflammation connection and how that affects neuronal transmission and brain nervous system communication, as well as inhibiting some of the more necessary neurochemicals to help dampen anxiety, such as GABA. GABA is one of our most calming neurochemicals. So that's the relationship between food sensitivities and anxiety. And some of the foods that I see to be most problematic, one of the biggest ones is gluten. So gluten sensitivity, non-celiac gluten sensitivity is what it's referred to as in the literature. And this is a very real thing. It is in fact on the rise, and that has to do more with how we grow how we grow our wheat and how we process gluten. But nonetheless, the most common symptom, even amongst celiacs, because a lot of people think, well, I don't have digestive symptoms, so I'm not gluten sensitive. The most common symptom, even amongst celiacs with people that are gluten sensitive, is not digestive, it's actually neurological. So anxiety, depression, brain fog, insomnia, fatigue, pain patterns, tingling and numbness sensations in the limbs, to give you an idea. So I've worked with people that struggle with panic attacks and panic disorders. And just from identifying and removing food sensitivities, they got off of 2 of their medications. So it's really, really powerful identifying these sensitivities. I always start by having people remove gluten, dairy, soy, corn, sugar, and processed food. We could also look at caffeine in some people, particularly if you're a fast metabolizer of caffeine. So if you're one of those people and you have a cup of coffee and you just become jittery really quickly, I would cut the caffeine. Caffeine has a half-life of like 12 hours too, so it can even affect you long into the evening if you have a cup of coffee during the day, if you're a fast metabolizer. Slow metabolizer, so it stays in the blood longer. So caffeine for some people, nonetheless though, going back to food sensitivities, in addition to testing for food sensitivities, which is my preferred method because it's quicker and much clearer, but you can also follow what's called an elimination diet, where you cut out some of the top 8 allergens. I generally will there's different forms of elimination diets, really and truly, and we base it on what the person needs. But I always do gluten, dairy, soy, corn, sugar, and processed foods. Start there, and then we tweak it based on the person. So sometimes we'll take out nuts and seeds, sometimes we'll take out nightshades, sometimes we'll take out all grains. But to give you an idea, that's where I would start. So tip number 1, balance blood sugar. We went through how to do that. Tip number 2 is to identify and remove food sensitivities. And then tip number 3 with looking at anxiety is emphasizing healthy nutrients. So nutrient deficiencies being associated with anxiety. And so from a nutrition perspective and the food we eat, how to emphasize nutrients. So specifically, I'm talking micronutrients. B vitamins are really big for this. B vitamins are needed for basically all of our neurochemical production, so serotonin and dopamine and the brain communication chemicals. We also need electrolytes and then healthy fats. Omega-3s, essential fatty acids are really big. But like minerals and we can go on and on really and truly from like iron, really go on and on from a nutrient perspective. But the point that I'm making is the connection with nutrient deficiencies. And some of the big ones that I see most commonly are B vitamins and essential fatty acids. So essential fatty acids, oftentimes, there was that whole low fat movement back in the 80s, which was just ruined health because oftentimes fat was traded for sugar. So it made it even worse. But in this case, really, this kind of goes back to balancing blood sugar also. So following a lower glycemic diet and higher fat diet, because the brain is 60% fat. So avocados, olive oil, nuts and seeds, as long as there's not a sensitivity, fatty fish like salmon or sardines or tuna. Supplementing with fish oil can be really helpful in order to reach that therapeutic level of omega-3s, EPA and DHA specifically. Flaxseed, chia seed, algae, these all contain the omega-3s. So balance, like eating sufficient and healthy fat and lowering, like really emphasizing fat in the diet and lowering carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates that are consumed are not refined sugar, minimizing grains, really looking at like starchy vegetables and fruit. So non-starchy vegetables, starchy vegetables, and fruit, and then like nuts and seeds would be the ideal forms of carbohydrates. Grains, minimum, maybe 3 servings per week, if that sometimes. But healthy fats really emphasized. And then nutrient density. So if you're not interested in supplementation, because I'll often use, like I said, fish oil or a multivitamin, different nutrients when needed, but there are nutrient dense foods that you could go with. So liver, I'm sure everyone's gonna cringe, but liver is like grass-fed, grass-finished beef liver is really high in B vitamins and iron and minerals, like organ meats in general, as long as they're really high quality or really high in minerals. And then there's like green algae like chlorella and spirulina. Those are high in B vitamins and different minerals and antioxidants. So there are these superfoods that you can eat in addition to a whole foods diet. But again, I'm really more of an advocate of, particularly when we're trying to heal something, of supplementing and kind of ramping up our nutrient density, and then we can get to where we rely more on food. But I've talked about, the role of supplementation in today's world, of how we need more. We have a higher demand of nutrients because our environment has changed, including our food quality. So I'm more of a proponent of supplementation, particularly with specific brands, like very high quality brands, but nonetheless, that'll help boost up the reservoirs. So to recap, looking at balancing blood sugar, identifying and removing food sensitivities, which we can do through testing or an elimination diet, and nutrient density, so restoring our nutrient status. And I emphasized omega-3s as well as certain micronutrients like B vitamins and minerals. All right, so that will always be a really powerful start to anxiety. Nutrition can form a great foundation to, again, kind of complement the mind work or breath work, exercise, different lifestyle patterns to create this really powerful trifecta for, like I said, not just managing the anxiety, but really and truly healing it. Okay, thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a great rest of your night.